that I answered him so harshly. But Mr. Douglas and I remained good friends throughout the years. Well, as I say, there were many eligible young men there in Springfield at that time. Now, I'd heard about this here Mr. Lincoln fellow, but I'd never laid eyes on the gentleman. Well, this particular evening, I was at a party at a friend's house. We called it a coterie. Oh, it was a gathering of young people. Some were newly married, and some were courting, and others were still looking out at the marketplace. We'd have some refreshments, and often we'd hire some musicians and have a dance. Well, this particular evening, there I was, standing in the drawing room, and I was chatting with Mr. Douglas. Now, the evening was growing rather long, and still this Mr. Lincoln hadn't made an appearance. And then I looked out into the hallway, and there was a long drink of water. Oh, my. He looked like a praying mantis. Why, his dark hair stood out from his head as though he'd just come through a cyclone. His coat sleeves were too short. His trousers were too short. And there he stood, cleaning his boots on the backs of his trousers. Oh, he came into the room like a whirlwind, slapping the gents on the back and telling jokes and stories as he went along. And I waited. I waited for this Mr. Lincoln fellow to make a proper introduction of himself. Well, the fiddler was just prepared to play the final dance of the evening when Mr. Lincoln came to me, and he said in his very country way, "Miss Todd, I would like to dance with you in the worst way." Mr. Lincoln and I did dance that evening, and I assure you, he dances in the worst way. Courtship was a fiery one, on again, off again. I suppose because we are both such independent-minded people, such free thinkers. Well, finally, in January of 1841, we broke off our engagement. It was by mutual consent, and we agreed to go our separate ways. But fate and our friends would have none of it. Now, a friend of mine, well, she sent me a message one morning. Mrs. Francis, her husband was the editor of the Sangamon newspaper then. She said she was ailing for several days and would appreciate a visit from me that evening. Well, I was concerned about my friend's health and welfare, so I went on down to see her. And who do I meet there but Mr. Lincoln? Oh, it had been months since we had seen one another. We just stood there staring, trying to figure out who should speak first. And then he came to me. He looked down into my face and said, "Mary, in the months that I have not seen you, I have been a most miserable man." I looked up into the soft gray eyes of my long, lean Kentuckian, and I replied, "Misery loves company." And so we were married. We married in November 4th of 1842. Oh, it was just a small wedding. Why, my sister Elizabeth was so angry with us, I gave her very little notice about our wedding. Why, when we were serving the wedding cake, it was still warm out of the oven. And oh, when Mr. Lincoln, he was late for the ceremony. And when he finally did arrive, he looked like a lamb going to slaughter. Oh, it was a rainy Friday evening. Well, we began our married life in a rented room above the Globe Tavern there in Springfield. 17 by 14 feet, $3 a week, including meals. Well, before long, we were blessed with our very first son. August 1st of 1843, our Bobby was born. Mr. Lincoln had stayed with me that whole night. Well, I was remarking earlier that when Mr. Lincoln came on in to see Bobby, I gave him a poke and said, "Mother, we have nothing to fear. The baby looks nothing like me." And he's always remarked that Bobby was a mite squat and he's more like a Todd rather than a Lincoln. Well, with our new baby, and why, he had a mighty good set of lungs on him, Bobby, we decided we should have a home of our own. So we bought a small one-story house on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets there in Springfield. Bought it from the Reverend Dresser. And soon after that, we welcomed our second son, Edward Baker Lincoln. He was named after a friend of Mr. Lincoln's, Dr. Baker. He was a frail child, prone to illness, but oh, he was such a joy to be with. Well, we settled into a right comfortable way of life there in Springfield. Of course, I was busy with my boys in my house, and Mr. Lincoln, of course, was busy in his law practice. Why, he was making a name for himself all over the state of Illinois. And soon some gentlemen approached him, and they requested that he run for the United States Congress. I was not surprised. I knew he had the seeds of greatness within him. Well, Mr. Lincoln did run in that election, and he won. The Lincolns were off to Washington. Oh, I was so excited to be going to Washington. However, I don't think Mr. Lincoln really understood the politics of Washington at that time, and I did not understand the social system of this infernal city. We were housed at a dirty little shabby boarding house, all four of us in one small room. Why, Mr. Lincoln, he was gone most of the time with the business of the government, and I was trapped in that small room with two rambunctious boys, mere toddlers. Well, I tried very hard to stay there, but I could not. We decided it'd be best if I went on back to Lexington to my family, to somewhat more comfortable accommodations. Oh, poor Mr. Lincoln, he was so sad. He was so afraid our boys would forget who he was. I would not let that happen. Oh, we wrote to one another. Oh, just about the business of living. Well, I recall one letter that Mr. Lincoln wrote to me. And in this letter, he set forth a proposition. You see, Mr. Lincoln has always been concerned about the size of my waistline. And he knew if I was down there in Lexington that I would be partaking of a sizable amount of ice cream. You see, there was a slave in my father's house, a gentleman by the name of Elmer, and Elmer was known all over Kentucky for his fine ice cream. And every time Elmer would make that ice cream, he'd bring a little glass up to my room. Well, Mr. Lincoln was somewhat concerned. And so in this letter, he proposed that I set aside 1 penny a week, and I take that penny on down to the butcher shop, and I have the butcher weigh me on the meat scale. And then I might send that number off to Mr. Lincoln that he might know my progress or lack of. As I recall, I did not answer that letter. Well, Mr. Lincoln had agreed that he would only serve 1 term in the Congress, and so we returned there to Springfield. Little did we know what grief lay ahead for us. One afternoon, my little boy Eddie began to run a fever. As the days and weeks passed, my boy grew sicker and sicker. My dear brother-in-law, Dr. Wallace, he tried very hard to save my boy. But very soon he told us that our little Eddie was in the Lord's hands. It was a cold, rainy evening in February of 1850.